So for our second session this morning, I'm pleased to invite to be our moderator, our very own NUIG colleague, Professor Padraic Kenna. Padraic is the organizer of the event, so we've got a lot to thank him for in putting today's event together. He lectures on housing and property law at NUI Galway and publishes and presents widely on housing law, rights and policy, particularly in the EU context.
It's good to have a space to speak about homelessness in this important event. I followed the guidelines for the speakers, so I will try to answer the question, what is the European Union doing good, what is the European Union doing bad, or what can be improved, and where would I like to be in 10 to 20 years. But let me first say 2 words about FEANTSA. FEANTSA is the only European NGO that works exclusively on the issue of homelessness. Of course, there's other European NGOs that touch upon homelessness from time to time, or that represent important stakeholders in the fight against homelessness. But the European NGO that exclusively works on homelessness, that's FEANTSA. And it's a multi-stakeholder platform. It started off as a sort of a trade union of the shelter sector more than 30 years ago. But now we have diversified our membership. Most are NGOs, most are providers of hostel accommodation, shelter and hostel accommodation. But increasingly, we also have cities, social housing companies, foundations, etc. as members. The idea is to bring together in one and the same place all the stakeholders you need to actually progress towards solving homelessness. And even if we do quite a bit of lobbying and advocacy work, our main focus is on knowledge generation and knowledge building and research. Because I think it's important because most of the policies in place at at local or national level are too little evidence-based. And I think the production of knowledge, the promotion of knowledge can actually have quite a big impact on homeless policies. So what is the European Union at the moment doing well on homelessness? Well, there's 3 things that I can mention. There's many things that they do well, but there's 3 things that are worth mentioning here. First of all, it created a favorable policy context for more EU action on the issue of homelessness in the future. Was just announced, the European Union launched the EU platform for combating homelessness. It's a new initiative. It's an official new initiative just in June, a couple of months ago. What is important about that is that this platform is supported by all 27 EU member states. It's rare that you get in the current European Union all member states supporting more EU action on a social issue. So I think we should make the best out of that. But not only the member states, also EU institutions and the most, the European Parliament, the Economic and Social Committee, Committee of the Regions, have signed up to the platform, as well as a number of other European stakeholders like NGOs and social partners. And they all signed the Lisbon Declaration, which underpins the work of this platform. And there the 2 important things in the Lisbon Declaration. There is, first of all, a commitment of all these partners, including all EU member states, to work together at EU level, and a commitment of the European Commission to facilitate that work. And secondly, the ambition to make substantial progress towards ending homelessness by 2030. Even if we don't end homelessness by 2030, switching from managing homelessness in the shelter sector to ending homelessness, that sort of paradigm shift would already be a great achievement. The second thing is that the European Union created unprecedented opportunities to use EU funding and financing for the fight against homelessness. I'm not going into detail, but there is the REACT-EU program, which relates to the old ESF and failed programs. There is the European Social Fund Plus, the new one that runs now, the European Regional Development Fund, and even InvestEU, which is about loans and guarantees. There is in these funding programs explicit and implicit references to homeless people as a target group in the laws underpinning these financing and funding instruments. That's real. That's real opportunities, and that's quite unique. It was not the case in the past. Homeless policy, the fact that member states have to have homeless policy is integrated as an enabling condition for some of these funds. It means that they can only spend the funds if they have a homeless policy in place. And homeless people helped are an output indicator, for instance, for the ESF Plus. That will make it easier to actually use the funds in practice for the fight against homelessness. And even there is some ring fencing of budgets of some of the funds. There's 3% of the ESF Plus reserved for the most deprived, which are defined as including homeless people, and in the child and 5% should go to the child guarantee, the EU child guarantee, which includes homeless families as a target group, as one of the 6 target groups, at least in those countries that have a child poverty rate which is more than average. And the third thing that the European Union is doing well, I think, is, and I don't want to be, like I said, in all modesty, of course, is that it funded FEANTSA for more than 30 years in a structural way. And apart from the fact that it gives me a job, which is of course great, it has allowed us to build a strong knowledge base and a network of organizations working on homeless people and experts. And that can be used as the building blocks for this EU platform. And we're happy to offer these building blocks. So what can the EU do better? There is 1 point more, 4 points, but I'll go through them quickly. I think the European Union can do better in mainstreaming homelessness in other policy areas. At the moment, the platform is led by DG Employment of the European Commission, which is of course a very important DG, but it means that the focus is very much on the competences that are held by DG Employment, child guarantee, disability, etc. And I think it's really, really important, if you want to have real impact on homelessness, that you have to enlarge to migration and asylum, anti-discrimination, health, etc. These are big priorities for the European Union, and homelessness needs a place there. And it is actually not yet integrated in the EU Migration Pact, in the EU Gender Equality Strategy, and not even in the EU Health Union. So that's one thing that can improve. The other thing that can improve is the strengthening of the human rights monitoring. I think it's really about time that we enlarge the role of the Fundamental Rights Agency to really work on social rights, including the right to housing. At the moment, there is some kind of a straitjacket imposed on the Fundamental Rights Agency that relates to anti-discrimination. Everything has to be related to anti-discrimination. Anti-discrimination is, of course, important, but it doesn't capture all human rights violations, and it is difficult to capture homelessness with anti-discrimination approach. So that's one call, one thing that can improve. The second thing is that there should be more support for European NGOs and other NGOs to engage in strategic human rights litigation. There is no money, or I'm not aware of any money available for that. And actually, it's worse. We are funded by DG Employment in a structured way. We get an operating grant, and we're not allowed to use that public money to enter into human rights litigation. That definitely has to change. The third thing is that the European Commission and the European Union should consider legislative means to address and prevent homelessness. Like, there is always a tendency to move to soft policy instruments, and that's fine. Learning can really have impact, research can really have impact, but there is also legislative means. And I think we can build on some of the EU laws, directives that exist and that mention homelessness. For instance, access to basic banking services. Homeless people are mentioned as a target group. Access to water. Homeless people are mentioned as a target group. So why not move to some kind of a legal initiative to guarantee access to emergency shelter for homeless people? It exists already for asylum seekers in EU legislations. It might come at European level for women fleeing gender-based violence if the Istanbul Convention gets integrated into EU law. Why not for homeless people? Like, you don't want shelters at the front door to make a difference between asylum seekers, women fleeing domestic violence, and other homeless people. So I think there is a case to be made for a guaranteed access to shelter at EU level, integrated in law. And then I think the fourth thing is that we should apply the do no harm principle. Even if the European Union has no direct competence in the area of housing, and probably that's a good thing, it can play a bigger role to avoid the negative impact of the policies that impact on housing affordability. I'm not going into detail. There's other people that are more expert than me. And so the final slide is, what does the ideal Europe look like for homelessness in the next 10 years? Padraic said next 10 to 20 years, but really I don't feel capable to look 20 years ahead, so I restricted myself to 10 years. I hope that by then the European platform on homelessness is a key part of EU social policy instruments, that we don't have to fight to keep it going, to keep homelessness on the agenda, that it's proactively led by the European Commission. I think there is some work to be done there. Still, the European Commission is hesitating about how proactive they want to lead this platform, how ambitious they want to be. That abundant, or at least sufficient funding is available at EU level for both mutual learning and for policies and services on the ground via the EU funds and EU financing mechanisms. And that hopefully FEANTSA is made redundant by then, even if that gets me out of a job. I think that would be a sign that we're making real progress. The second thing is that I hope that member states by then will have made substantial progress towards ending homelessness, and that there is some kind of a systemic change to housing-led approaches with a clear focus on the prevention, so that we don't constantly fall back on the shelter system to manage homelessness, but that we really move towards ending it. And the last thing is that the social function of housing takes priority or has taken priority over the economic function in EU policy, because there is a strong reliance on the economic focus, on the economic functions of housing, and too little on social function. Even if we see some reasons to be hopeful, reasons that it's going to change. And something very practical in that sense is that I hope that the Green Deal, which is a big priority for the European Union, will be a success by then, but also for poor homeowners and poor tenants, social as well as in the private sector, because I think there is a lot of initiatives on the table that might have a huge impact, negative impact on poor homeowners and tenants. So if these three things come true, I would be a happy man.
Our next speaker is Dara Turnbull, who works with Housing Europe, and the floor is yours, Dara.
So the state of, firstly, who is Housing Europe? Well, Housing Europe is the European Federation of Public, Cooperative and Social Housing. We represent providers of affordable housing right across Europe, both inside and outside the European Union. And in the Irish context, we are represented by the Irish Council for Social Housing and Cooperative Housing Ireland. So the State of Housing in Europe 2021, it's a report which we publish every 2 years. This report came out back in the first part of this year. Usually it comes in the second part, but given the impact on COVID, we really wanted to push forward that release to categorize and catalogue some of the early impacts we saw from the COVID pandemic on the housing market, indeed what challenges that has highlighted, because I think we all realize in the past year and a half or so that many of the things we thought about where we live and how we live actually are not adequate. Maybe we don't have enough light, maybe we don't have enough access to local amenities and so on. And I think many people have quickly learned that a home is not necessarily also an office and a creche, as well as being a place to live and relax and to enjoy yourself. So indeed, the report discussed many different challenges across Europe. Most of these challenges, if indeed not all of these challenges, existed prior to the pandemic. What the pandemic has effectively done is really highlight the fault lines between the haves and the have-nots in terms of housing access and quality and so on across Europe. So to give you a few of the issues that we mentioned, 18% of adults in the EU today spend 30% or more of their disposable income on housing. There's been a very strong growth in house prices over the past decade, more than 30% for house prices and about 15% for private rents over the last decade to the end of 2020. And again, that's just an EU national picture. To give you another issue, those figures again are national, but they can hide very important dichotomies. Unfortunately, we don't have really good, high quality, comparable data at a EU level in terms of housing affordability issues within the cities, which would be very interesting to have. And indeed, we heard from Kim van Sparrentak earlier on, and one of the key recommendations of her report is that we do improve drastically the quality of the data that we have in terms of housing affordability and so on. So this just very quickly is a chart that myself and my colleagues at Housing Europe put together a few weeks ago, which tried to estimate the housing affordability for a typical kind of a young couple in many different EU cities. And you see that if we set 30% as the threshold, that's the bottom orange line, that indeed very, very few cities can consider themselves to be affordable. Just to highlight the case of Dublin, a one bedroom apartment would be about 35.7% of your disposable income, whereas a two bedroom apartment would be about 43.8%. And Dublin is certainly not alone in terms of those affordability challenges. One of the other issues that we really highlighted in the state of housing was the lack of supply of housing and the unmet need for housing, both ordinary housing, private rental and home ownership, but also indeed in the social and affordable housing sphere. So some of the figures we highlight is about a 3.5 million unit deficit of housing in England, at least 1 million units in Germany, although those figures are now a few years old, approximately 330,000 additional units required in the Netherlands, and about 165,000 shortfall in Ireland in the years leading up to the pandemic. The report also highlighted a number of other issues which are coming to the fore, particularly around the aging population and the housing requirements that will have going forward. So many countries in Europe are now beginning to think about how they house and what the housing requirements will be of an aging population. And indeed, one of the trends which we expect to come out of the COVID pandemic is what they call deinstitutionalization, meaning that people will stay in their homes and be cared for in their homes more so than moving into nursing homes or some form of later life care. So we need to start thinking now about how we can accommodate those sorts of challenges going forward. Persistent homelessness is also a huge issue, which Freek very eloquently outlined in his presentation, so I won't touch on that. Another thing is the significant public and private funding gap for housing development and renovation. So the Prodi report from a few years ago estimated that the annual funding gap for social and affordable housing in the EU was roughly 56 billion euro per year versus what would need to be spent actually to meet the demand for social and affordable forms of housing. The other issue I've been asked to talk about today is this idea of greener homes and more sustainable homes and what the role the EU can play in that. So indeed, we know that homes are responsible for about 1/4 of the final energy consumption in the EU. So if we are serious about climate change and we're seriously about getting to net zero, then indeed homes will be an integral part of meeting that challenge. Having said that, the European Commission currently estimates that the annual funding gap in terms of spending on home renovations and climate sustainability in the residential housing sector versus what's needed to actually get towards net zero is about 115 billion euro a year across the European Union. That's an incredibly significant amount of money when you think about that's on an annual basis. The national recovery plans, most of which have now been finalized, do show some improvement, ambition in this regard, although again, there is still a huge cavern that needs to be filled going forward if we're really serious about making our homes more sustainable in the long run. And again, something Freek touched on briefly, but I'll mention again is, so the Green Deal, but who is it really for? Our analysis shows that there is a huge risk of a dichotomy or a cavern opening up between different types of household, between tenants, and homeowners and different types of tenants and different income groups in terms of who can actually take advantage of various public funding schemes for renovations and so on. So there is a risk that we will have people who are left behind with the EU Green Deal and the ambition to make our homes more environmentally sustainable. In that regard, I'm often reminded of this recent quote by Frans Timmermans, the European Commission Executive Vice President for the Green Deal. He said, "Fairness is key. Our ambition should help, not hurt the most vulnerable in society. The transition will be just, or there will be no transition." So that is the ambition. That is the signal that the European Commission has sent out on this issue. The question is whether or not the policies being put forward by the EU and by national governments are credible in that regard. So one of the issues, because I realize I'm running out of time, one of the issues is been announced recently is to extend the European Emissions Trading Scheme, the ETS, to the building sector, to the built environment. It is expected that that will increase energy costs for ordinary homeowners, which will particularly impact those who are already experiencing energy poverty or live in kind of low income situations. In order to counteract that inevitability, the European Union proposes the Social Climate Fund, the SCF, which will disperse about 72.2 billion in funding to help low-income households and others to transition to a more environmentally sustainable future. And that is over the period of 2025 to 2032. So again, if you think about the 115 billion per annum figure we talked about, that 72.2 billion over a 7-year period really is a drop in the ocean. From the point of view of Housing Europe, members, we've committed to renovating an additional 4 million homes by 2030. However, if we want those homes to be upgraded to an A or B energy rating, we estimate that the additional funding required to do that will be about 13 billion euro a year, over and above the 23 billion euro a year that the sector is already spending on renovation of homes for primarily low-income people. And to conclude, today's event actually falls quite well for us because Housing Europe is about to announce or release our own kind of view on the Fit for 55 package, which I'm sure you're aware of. And this is the statement on what we think about the Social Climate Fund. So just to pick out the first line, the Social Climate Fund will not be sufficient to compensate for the increase in the cost of energy expected from the introduction of the ETS for buildings and transport. So effectively, we remain to be convinced, and indeed our current view is that the EU has great ambition in terms of making our homes more sustainable, making our economy more sustainable, but the actual tools they're putting in place to achieve that and to make sure that to go back to Franz Schirmer's quote, that we do have a just transition, we're not there today.
So thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to discuss this topic, and all the presentations were really fascinating until now. So I've learned a lot myself. So yeah, my name is Jourdan. I'm the Executive Director of Positive Money Europe. Just for those who don't know us, we're an NGO based in Brussels, and we basically do campaigns, research, and advocacy work around all issues around the European Central Bank, really. And our goal is basically to make the European Central Bank contribute to a more fair and sustainable and democratic economy. So as part of that, housing is a key aspect for us that we want to address more in the future, in the sense that the key part of my talk would be to try to convince you that the European Central Bank is basically playing a problematic role currently in terms of allowing people to access affordable housing, and I'm going to explain that a bit more. So the first thing to say, and I think this morning Sharon Donnelly from the Central Bank of Ireland has touched upon this, but I think I would have hoped that she has displayed this chart on the left-hand side, which is a chart that I borrowed from the ECB, which shows the connection between the issuance of loans, and obviously mostly for mortgages or loans for house purchase, and the house price as such. I think this is quite straightforward and obvious for many people, but I'm still baffled by this fact is not provided out loud like I'm doing now. This says that the correlation is pretty straightforward. It's demonstrated by research. On the left-hand side, it's research by ECB. On the right-hand side, it's research by Joshua and Collins and others who have built the database over 2 centuries, over more countries than Europe. And we always see this pattern that basically the more bank issue loans for house purchase, the more houses pricing go up. And why is that? I mean, again, it's pretty straightforward. It's demand and supply dynamic. This has been mentioned several times, but I think this morning, so far, many people have emphasized the lack of supply of housing, and it's certainly true there are problems there. I'm not going to deny that, but I think I would like to focus your attention a bit more on the demand side. So this demand for housing is driven by population growth and so on. But I think the demand is also driven by whether people can access loans for buying a house. And a key feature of the banking system is that the banking sector on aggregate has technically an unlimited capacity to offer loans for people and for companies. Of course, there are limits to that. Sharon Donnelly this morning said, there are macroprudential rules. If you're not if you're too risky as a household, you won't get a loan from the bank. But it's not like there's a shortage of funds for banks to lend money to people. It's more like the only constraint for banks to offer loans is basically how many customers they have that want to get a loan. And of course, then the interest rate will be different depending on risk profiles and depending on the interest rate by ECB. But the key point here is that there's complete elasticity of demand for housing purchase through loan issuance. And of course, in front of that, we have a shortage of supplies on housing for very strong reason. First, and this is also an obvious point that no one ever says, but this land scarcity. Every country has limitation, especially when we have a urbanization pattern that's more and more people live in concentrated areas. So we end up having shortage of land, simple as that. There's obviously limited investment over the past decades. That's, you know, neoliberalism on steroids that have been causing this. And even if we had strong willingness, you know, strong public willingness to invest into housing production, you know, in constructing new homes, there will always be a delay in terms of, you know, building a home takes time basically, and you always have a tension between demand for bank loans going faster than basically the production of housing. So that's why I strongly believe we have housing price inflation going on a structural basis by definition from this system. I would like to draw your attention on the second chart, which I'm sorry, I just borrowed it from a French report. It's not completely translated, but I think you'll get the idea pretty clear. So it's the number of dwellings owned by people depending on their wealth level. So the more you go on the right-hand side of this chart, the more people are rich and the more they possess homes. It's also a very straightforward point. I think many people, it's instinctive, right? But it's good to have figures on this, because what you see here is that basically the more rich you are, the more housing you own. And I would like to make you think about the connection between this chart and the chart and the things I said before. Why is it possible that rich people get more homes? Isn't there a link there about the fact that rich people can have more easy access to bank loans, and therefore it's more easy for them to accumulate properties and then to rent them out? So I think this is why I think the banking sector and the ECB that's sitting on top of it play a key role in basically making it easier for rich people who already have real assets or any types of wealth. It's easier for them to accumulate housing and therefore to prevent others from accessing home ownership. So the ECB and the central bank, the commercial bank system, is facilitating accumulation of wealth for some and disproportion of wealth for others. So once I've said that, so the role of the central bank in particular is very problematic. I think I've already said that, but just maybe to recap at this point, and also to bring another point that I've not mentioned yet, because it's been a big debate in the last few months. The way the ECB measures inflation through the HICP index that's produced by Eurostat, the EU statistical agencies, structurally underestimates the cost of housing price. If you look at the HICP index, they estimate that the cost of housing for people is 6.5%. Obviously, I think we're all paying a rent or some form of mortgage payment that are higher than 6% of our monthly budget. We all know this. And, you know, I won't go into the details of why this is the case. It's partly because history, you know, there are not similar data in all countries. So, you know, it's not the ECB's fault that this is the case, but currently the inflation index that the ECB is looking at for accomplishing its monetary policy mandate is not incorporating enough the cost of housing. And therefore, the housing price inflation that the ECB is generating by providing low interest rate and by supporting banks' money creation, the ECB does not compute the effect of its policies when it looks into its own inflation index. That is the main, the inflation index is really the main way that the ECB's performance is evaluated. The ECB's mandate is to provide 2% inflation, but again, this does not include housing costs. Okay, so even another point is that, and I'm going to go in details here, but in public speeches, I remember Mario Draghi saying this so many times, and also central bank governors, they're in denial mode about this. Most often, we've heard the ECB president say, "Oh, we do not see a housing bubble. We do see tensions in certain cities, but even if there was a generalized problem, this would be a role for macroprudential policy to mitigate that problem, and it's not a problem of monetary policy." And I think I deeply disagree on this. As I said before, the housing price bubble is a structural and systemic issue that the ECB generates. So it's not the case that you can say, "Oh, it's only the problem in a few cities." It's much bigger than that. And finally, and we've seen that in the last 5 years and more, the new policies of the ECB, so-called unconventional policies, quantitative easing, asset purchases, negative interest rate, have just exacerbated this problem even more. So just one way to think about this is when you have nearly 0% or 0% interest rate on the ECB policy, that means people right now, if you're in a good situation, you can borrow money maybe at 1% at your bank. But of course, you need to have enough capital to do that. You need to have a certain income level. You need to have a stable jobs, depending on macroprudential regulation. So basically, not everyone is able to take advantage of low interest rates right now. And that's a key problem that no one is really, I think, mentioning. Okay, so just moving on. So a key decision that ECB made recently was to tackle the inflation measurement problem that I mentioned. So they decided to include the owner-occupied housing cost into the HICP. I'm not going to go into the statistical discussion on this now, but basically they are trying to do something. But when you look at what will likely be the effect of these changes in the way they measure inflation, you can see this chart is again a chart from the ECB itself. And basically what you see is that if you do what the ECB say they will do, the changes in the inflation level will be almost none. So the difference is really trivial here. You see the lines are almost touching each other. So basically what the ECB has decided to do is a lot of noise for little change in how the ECB will think about this issue, I think. So we have to tackle that. So in a nutshell, what we think the right approach should be is that basically we need to talk about credit guidance policies. What do we mean by that? We mean by that the ECB and other regulators, not just the ECB in that occasion, but we need to think about where credit goes. Where does bank lending goes? Who can access to bank credit? On what terms? And basically, I think we need to reverse the logic like that. The more you're rich, the more banks can lend to you. It should almost be the opposite. That if you are on low income, you should have privileged access to loans, at least for accessing home ownership. So there should be an advantage there should be incentives for banks to help people access housing. And on the opposite, it should be discouraged to leverage on bank lending in order to accumulate and speculate on real estate. So that's one thing. The second thing is when the ECB needs to stimulate the economy, currently they use one-size-fits-all policies such as interest rate and quantitative easing. Those are very blunt policies. Another alternative for that would be to use what economists call helicopter money, which is a form of social dividend, you could say, where we would give checks to individuals, to households, to stimulate the economy, instead of creating policies that just exacerbate housing price inflation. And finally, it's time to talk about fiscal and monetary coordination and to give more room for public investment to also support the problem of the lack of supply of housing that we also mentioned this morning. There are other policies I won't detail here, but of course we also endorse what other speakers have said before. There should be more encouragement from member states to invest in public housing, better standards to protect people against evictions and repossession. That I'm aware this has been a big issue in Ireland and in Spain as well. There's a very lack of EU legislation on that field to protect people against eviction. Just the last word to say, these slides I've been showing, we just published a blog by my colleague Mark Beckman this morning. It's on our website. I will put the link as well, but there's more details to what I just said. And I wanted to thank my colleague as well for helping me prepare this talk. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Stan. That's a really remarkable insight here and some really valuable proposals for the next 10 years for the European Central Bank. I should say we're publishing a report on all these presentations. We'll be publishing the slides and we'll be publishing a detailed report where every presenter has written a summary of their presentation. And so our next speaker is Rory Hearne, whose book Housing Shock, of course, is a bestseller, as you know, Rory. So I'll go straight over. The floor is yours.
Okay, so in terms of my presentation, there's some crossover with what has been presented already, so I won't repeat what has been done. But I suppose to give a bit of a perspective from Ireland, a member state, the crisis in terms of housing has many facets and aspects to it in Ireland. One of the most pernicious ones, and of course is the most egregious violation of the right to housing, is homelessness. And in particular, we're seeing both, we have seen over the last 6-7 years is an unprecedented rise in homelessness of both individuals and in particular, the new emergence of what's called family and child homelessness. And you can see from these graphs. These are figures of Dublin in terms of presentation of both presentation. This is on the left-hand side. We see here, this is the numbers of families who are becoming homeless. This is 2014. This is 2016, 2018, and 2020. And what we see here, a dramatic rise from 2014 onwards in the number of families who are presenting as homeless. And we saw that rise really up till the pandemic. And then what was really fascinating was, of course, this effective collapse, a real fall in the presentation of families who were homeless during the pandemic. And of course, that was because, in large part, due to the policy measure, which introduced a ban on evictions over the period of the pandemic, was reintroduced later on when we had restrictions on mobility during various lockdowns. And when that ban was removed then earlier this year, what we've seen since is the re-emergence of families presenting at a large scale, on a larger scale, similar to pre-pandemic levels in terms of being homeless. And in large part, they are coming from the private rental sector, evictions, landlords selling their properties. So we have this major crisis ongoing and re-emerging in a, well, we're still within a pandemic context. And similarly, we see that, between 2014 and 2018, there was a 300% increase in family and child homelessness. And we know, and increasingly research is highlighting, the detrimental impact and potentially long-term impact of homelessness on children. It is an adverse childhood experience, which can have psychological implications, can have developmental implications, particularly extended periods of time in emergency accommodation. And again, we see this fall, very dramatic fall in family homelessness in emergency accommodation over the period of the pandemic, but starting to rise again in the current context. That's just a bit about the homelessness aspect. We also have other aspects of the crisis in Ireland. It's much broader. We have issues of the rents that Dara Turnbull talked about, explained very high rents, significant increase in recent years, the fall in home ownership rates. And we also have a high rate of young adults who are living at home with their parents. And while we are close to just above the European Union average, we're at 54% of young adults between 18 and 34, we are double what the rate is in Sweden. And I suppose what this shows is that there are different cultural aspects to young people, young adults, and not so young adults living at home in the family home, but it's certainly not traditional in Ireland for young adults to live at home with their parents for extended periods. Traditionally, young adults moved out in their early 20s and got their own home. So this is a substantial cultural shift in Ireland, but it's not a cultural shift driven by choice, but one driven by the inadequate supply of affordable housing. So the question of what's the EU doing well then? There is absolutely, and this has been pointed out, so I won't repeat it, the EU Green New Deal, recognizing the need for the EU to lead in investment and climate resilience through public infrastructure investment, very, very important principle. Also, the ECB supporting the debt situation of EU member states, enabling member states to borrow on interest rates and enabling this to remain very low. This is vital to supporting member states continue to invest in social and affordable housing. In particular, also the stimulus response to COVID, in contrast with the response to the economic crash of 2008 and 2009, where austerity was enforced as the response. In this time, we have learned, and apparently the EU as well, also has learned from the failed austerity policies, and we've seen stimulus as a response, which is absolutely essential that continues. And in particular, I suppose, around the fiscal rules is quite important on that, and there's decisions coming up on that in the coming months. The European Pillar of Social Rights is also a really excellent initiative, which puts affordable, secure, quality homes, the right to housing, central to policy and vision for the EU. So what does the EU need then to improve the situation? There is the need still, I think, to revise economic and housing models used in EU policy making away from what would broadly be called a neoliberal boom bust cycles, from the view of housing as an asset, as an investment, the dominance of the market as the key area to provide housing, and instead to move towards more a broadly what might be called social democratic approach to housing as social market rather than free market, but in particular one that recognizes the fundamental role of housing to health, to education, to climate, to the well-being of EU citizens, and therefore cannot be left to the vagaries and inequalities of the market, and to recognize the market is changing in housing. The increased role of global equity funds, real estate funds in housing globally means that the market is no longer the market of the 1980s or 1990s or even early 2000s, whereby it was between homeowners, maybe wealthy people buying homes, that there is a new player in the housing market that really radically changes how we have to view it. There is a competitor for housing now, which is the real estate equity funds, who want to convert housing into a commodity that essentially is another commodity of theirs that they extract as much profit from. And this is a real challenge. We're seeing it in Ireland as a real challenge, and I think it's a real challenge across the EU. The question then is in terms of what the EU needs to do. It needs to, I think, in particular, support the not-for-profit housing sectors to deliver and the state to become key guarantors and deliverers of housing. And in terms of that, I think there needs to be a reassessment of state aid rules for social housing, which would enable member states to invest on a much broader level in public and not-for-profit provision of social housing for not just low-income earners, but also for middle-income earners in housing need as well. I think that's very fundamental. Essentially trying to expand out the Vienna model of housing to become a key vision for Europe in its different forms as it would take, but essentially that concept that social housing support should not be something just for low-income earners, but member states should be encouraged and enabled to invest in social housing for middle-income earners also. And I think this is particularly important in the context of young, emerging generation rent households. Generation is referred to who are at home for a long time in their and unable to move out of their parents' homes. And the impacts, of course, of that on the economy in terms of restricting people's independence, their ability to take up employment. So there are real economic impacts on that. I think there is a need to extend, of course, beyond March of next year, the suspension of the fiscal rules to enable member states to continue to borrow for investment in building social and affordable housing. Social and affordable housing is one of the key areas that can really address the climate area, the issue of climate mitigation, of reduction of energy consumption within homes. But there's a real problem that if it is left to the market to largely deliver, that there will be a huge inequality in that adjustment. And if the EU wants to achieve, and member states want to achieve a climate adjustment, which is societies are engaged in on a cohesive basis, where everybody is buying in, then I really think it needs to deliver affordable energy efficient homes, particularly for low and middle income earners, as a key dividend within the transition to a zero carbon, low carbon societies. As I mentioned earlier, also there needs to be better regulation of financialization, particularly the predatory real estate financial actors who are playing an increasing role in the residential sectors in locking out the possibilities of affordable housing, purchasing land, pushing up rents and house prices. And also we need more EU support for cooperative housing and community land trusts as a key to green housing delivery, building green homes and community. So my ideal Europe then, to finish up, I hope I haven't gone too much over time, in 10 to 20 years, is that the human right to housing is a guiding principle for housing and economic and social policy also in the EU, and where everybody has access to affordable, secure, sustainable homes,